Hello, everyone. Welcome to our free webinar for post-processing about nature photography. We have 5 presenters. I'm going to be presenting for Verena since she can't be here today. So it's going to be presenters that are listed over here. And we're going to talk about some of our techniques of what we do in post-processing, as well as how we capture the photos. Majority of this presentation is going to be based on post-processing. So this is a discussion. This is not going to be a detailed how to do post-processing presentation. So we'll try to answer some questions. We'll give you some tips. We'll tell you how we do the post-processing. Now, if you guys are interested in finding out details, check out the sale that we are running. It is the sale will expire in next 72 hours. So you have 3 more days after the presentation is over to check out some of the products. So there are 2 ways to purchase products on Visual Wilderness. You can just go out and buy a single product if you want. And with that purchase, you can download the video tutorial. The next way to purchase is you just subscribe to our streaming service. And if you subscribe to the streaming service, you'll just be able to stream everything that we offer. But like Netflix, you have to pay monthly fee or yearly fee. All right, so let me start out by asking a question to everybody. And once we have that question answered, we are going to start our presentation. So the way the presentation is going to go is we're going to go in order. So let's see who's first in presentation. All right, so this is the order we're going to go in our presentation. Alan's going to be first, followed by Colby, David, and Kate, and then we'll just sort of do a wrap up to show you guys how we do things, okay? All right, so let me ask you guys, everybody, a question. When you look at nature photography, expense is a big consideration, right? It's expensive to buy gear, it's expensive to purchase travel. So let me ask everybody a question. Is travel the most expensive part of nature photography? Or is it the gear? Or is it the fact that you want to quit your job and not have any income? What do you guys think? What is the most expensive part of nature photography? What does everybody think? You guys can answer in the chat if you want. Travel. Yeah. I have to say, I put more money into travel than my entire gear combined in a year. So I'm getting like a ton of questions saying travel is the most expensive part, right? But I'm going to turn this over to Alan, and Alan is going to argue that travel is not the most expensive part of nature photography, right? So I'll stop my share, and Alan, I'm going to turn the screen over to you.
Do you all know there's a pandemic out there? Where are you going?
That's
anyway,
right.
It's kind of a trick question, isn't it? For me, and I'm not really an adventure photographer like some of my colleagues that are here today. And I have to be honest, I'm almost in awe of those people who are true landscape and adventure photographers and are just out and traveling. I just get totally intimidated by the vastness of it, which is why I go to macro and more tabletop stuff. But so I don't think we need to travel in order to find beautiful things. I think we can find them either on our roof decks or in our backyards, or we can just literally have things delivered to our house and set things up. So for me, that's the thing. I can't imagine traveling right now because there's too much craziness going on. So that's my point of view. I don't know how much more to say about that. I say everyone should stay home, wear a mask, and do the right thing, and let's beat this insidious thing that's affecting our world. So there's that. In terms of, is this where you want me to like talk, Jay, and like share things, or do you want to go through more questions first?
No, I think you tell us that if you don't think travel is the most expensive part of nature photography, how do you create your images?
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you. Let me share. And so can you see my screen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So for me, while I'm looking at things that like Colby and David are shooting out in the wilds, in the national parks and the exotic places, I'm just building my own. So I don't need to go and find the butte. I'll cut up some fruits and vegetables and create my own sort of mini landscapes. Or I'll literally just throw a potted orchid in a dark, shadowy corner of my home and play around with it and just play. Or literally take another orchid and go so deep into it that it becomes another world for me. So I find it very easy to get lost in the beauty of little things. And of course, as we're off traveling, I imagine most of you who are travel and, you know, landscape photographers are coming across, you know, critters and creatures. And so I just bring my own and take them out of their cages and put them in. I find that there's beauty in things as they're decaying, as they're aging, which is very much a naturalistic approach. And sometimes I will just take challenges. In this case, this was, you know, my bride-to-be said, why don't you do something with lint, which, you know, there's not that much lint lying around our house until we started a collection of it and literally had like Tupperware containers full of lint. Now, for those of you who don't know, lint is mainly blue. So finding lint that is more colorful becomes its own challenge. So now like your excursions become layered with other things. But literally, I just like getting into the small things that I can bring into my home. That doesn't mean that I don't go out and go exploring, but it's more local and it's a little bit more private these days. The next part for me is what I do with it when I get home, because for me, everything photographic is kind of like this dual bit of exercise and or therapy. For me, going out and shooting, and there's a difference between finding things and making things, so I give myself those sort of two different divergent challenges. But then there's the what happens when I get home and what happens when I start my editing process. And that's where, for me, it takes on a very Zen, almost therapeutic approach. So I practice something called creative sketching, and I'm going to jump ahead, where I will literally start with an image. Here's one right out of the camera, and then very quickly, literally in 2 or 3 minutes, you know, go through as many different iterations as I can to see where I want to take an image. So these 4 images that I just went through is part of my practice. It lets me explore without preconceptions. It lets me see what's possible, because, you know, depending on my mood, I will either take something to a bright and happy place, or, you know, it's sort of hard to avoid the current events that we're all surrounded with. There are things that are making us a little bit more sad or angry. And so I find that there are times where I let my mood dictate my processing. In these cases, I was happy. In other cases, I will let my mood take me to, you know, a darker place. Sometimes I have to force myself out of it. But knowing how to work with the tools is ultimately the most important thing, so that no matter what you have in your head or in your heart, you know how to bring it out in your image. So that's where I spend a lot of time, and you know, in the courses that I've been invited and feel very privileged to be able to share, this going through the how-to and why is very important to me, and that's what I want everybody to know. I work primarily in Lightroom, but you know, we're going to be doing hopefully soon some Capture One tutorials, and also I am sort of behind in getting to shooting some actual in-person, here's how I shoot, like literally in the studio behind me or the deck next to me, or out in gardens. So those are coming hopefully before Christmas. So that's all I'm going to say for now. And I don't know if there are any questions, but.
All right, so I put in a link for everybody. If you wanted to purchase Alan's tutorials, the link is there. I am also going to wait and see if anybody has any questions for how Alan produces these things right in the studio behind where he's sitting, or in the deck that you see on his right. All right, Alan, here's our first question. Can you talk a little bit about lighting?
Oh yeah. So as you can see, I have like my whole New York condo is a wall of glass, like everything. And I've got east, west, and north exposure. So there is a lot of natural light shooting, but sometimes I'm busy during the day or I'm out during the day. So I have a sort of a lighting room full of what I work with are continuous LED lights. Why? Because I just find them, I like working with bicolor lighting so that I can work and make things warm or cool and play with temperature. I also like the immediacy of the what you see is what you get nature of an LED as opposed to a flash. And so I have a host of nanlight gear, and those include tubes and flat panels and round studio, the equivalent of monolights, and all the appropriate adapters. And I think, Jay, have we done anything where I've shown all the lighting yet? Or?
Yeah, we have. I was just about to say that your first tutorial first online class you did, that is going to show all the lighting that you talk about. So if you guys really want to know exactly detail what type of lighting Alan uses, that's one of them. There's also an online class we did where working with light, where Alan shows how light is affecting mood in post-processing. So if you guys want to see all that, you can go to Visual Wilderness link that I put up, and you'll be able to see that. Okay. All right, so another question is, what lenses do you use for this?
Well, let's see, so I shoot a combination of medium format. I'm a Fuji shooter, so I use a 120, which is the Fuji medium format equivalent of a 100 or a 90 millimeter macro lens. But then I also have an X-T3, so I'll use their, what is the equivalent on the downside, whatever. It's the, I primarily a macro lens shooter. I have, and on top of that, I also will work with bellows and focusing rails. Those come from a company called NovaFlex, but you can get them in multiple places. What those do is just allow me to go deeper, to extend the minimum focusing distance on an image, and the focusing rails just allow for very precise either forward or lateral focusing. So I don't believe in starting with tripods. I want people to explore what they're seeing, particularly in macro. It's very different from a big epic landscape. There are many subtleties when you're in super close on an image. So what I will do is I will take like 100 shots, and then I will narrow down, in like a few minutes. These are all creative exercises to get the crap out of your system, and then begin to use your muscle memory and sort of determine what spoke to you as you were going through that immediate exercise, and then get to a few images and then perfect those, and then finally set up on a tripod and with focusing rails really, really perfect the image. So between the lenses and the gear, it does matter, especially in my practice, because every minute, fraction of a millimeter matters, where I'm trying to determine where I want you to look and what I want in focus and out of focus. Really.
I have a question for you, Alan, actually. I'm curious as well, even though I'm on the panel. So with your stuff, do you use like extension tubes and whatnot as well? Or do you crop in after you've taken the shots, or you try to fill the frame with every one of your images to maximize the megapixel and the resolution?
So I do have extension tubes. Again, I'm a Fuji guy, so I believe in making sure the system is intact. So I do use their tubes, but I find I have more flexibility with bellows. Mm-hmm. So those are more my go-to tools. And again, I try and get it as right as possible. But when you're working with a bigger camera, I find I have gone through phases where I'm sure we all have, where like we get a little too close. And maybe that's as a macro photographer. I don't know that there's any such thing as a landscape photographer. But I find I force myself to take a step back. Like once I'm done and I think I'm really done, and it's like instead of like moving on to whatever my next subject is, I take a full step back and then do it again. And lately I'm finding that more breathing room. It's sort of my breathing room period, because we all need to breathe these days. I find myself like collectively holding our breath. Sure. It's these past couple of years. So,
The,
yeah.
So the other thing that I think, Colby, to give everybody an idea is that extension tube has diminishing effect based on the focal length. So if you put in a 25 millimeter extension tube on 180 millimeter focal length lens, the magnification effect is small. If you use the same 25 millimeter on a 50 millimeter macro lens, it's a much bigger effect. So if you have bellows, I think your range of effects that you can get from bellows, I think, is much larger than just extension tubes.
One last tool to think about and explore is a reversing ring, and particularly one with autofocus pass-through. So every lens can be reversed, and there is a algorithm that allows you to figure out what the magnification is. And so simply by turning your lens around and just connecting it with adapters, your entire kit of lenses now all become macro lenses.
Nice.
Those of you that are into that.
Yeah, that is, but your focusing is manual, so you really need some sort of great focus
No, it
assist.
depends on the gear. So again, I'm a NovaFlex guy, and they have depending on the lens transitions, because now it's not just like there are lens adapters and then there were reversing rings. So you can take a Nikon lens and put it on a Canon camera, or a legacy, like an antique lens, and put it on a modern camera. But now and so those are adapters, but reversing rings will allow you to have full auto pass through depending on the brand you buy. So how much do you want to spend versus how comfortable are you focusing manually?
And just to add to that, NovaFlex has a great focusing rail for macro photography. We use it all the time.
I've got.
So one more question, and then we'll go to the next section. What is auto pass-through or autofocus? Sorry.
Okay. So with most modern cameras, they will let you focus automatically. So there are connectors on your lens. If you unscrew your lens, you'll see some like little gold rectangles, and if you look at your camera body, you'll see those same things. So that's electronics that lets the lens pass information to the camera. And so for those of you who put your camera on autofocus, this allows that. If depending on the combination of lens tools you use, first of all, every camera can be set to manual, but if you have a need to reverse, like we were just discussing, there are adapters that don't have the auto pass through, so it just forces you to focus manually, which is not a bad thing.
So, all right. So I think what I wanted to do was that take the next session of our post-processing, and I'm going to ask everybody another question. So, Alan, you going to hang around, or are you done? So
I'm going to hang around for a little bit, but then at some point I am going to turn my screen off because I have to run in and out, but I do want to keep participating. So
all right. So I think that we'll open up a short session at the end of the presentation. So if people have questions, and if you guys have questions for Alan, what you can do is you can actually send it to us, or you can check out his tutorial. So either case would be just fine. All of these lighting questions that Alan talks about today, they're all answered in the tutorial. He also shows how he manipulates lighting in post-processing, which is just absolutely fascinating to watch, guys. So if you haven't watched one, go ahead and watch it. And also in future, look for Alan's upcoming tutorials on visual wilderness, as well as his free webinars that he does every once in a while. Yeah, whenever he has time. So look forward for all that. So, all right. So let me start again by sharing my screen. And let's see what we can do. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you guys another question. So, all right, so we talked about this being travel photography. So let's talk about the next thing about nature photography, all right? What is the biggest mistake that a nature photographer can make? Okay, so we're not talking about nature photographer losing his life here, right? We're talking about mistakes photography mistakes. I know a lot of people may point out saying, hey, Raina got hit by an iceberg sometimes, but that's not the kind of mistakes we're looking for.
I'm pretty sure you got hit by an iceberg too there, buddy.
I actually fell in the water. I didn't get hit by an iceberg, but I did destroy.
You can't put this all on Verena. I'm just saying.
That's true. I did fall in the water. I lost my camera, but that was not the biggest photography mistake I have ever made. Trust me. Focusing. That is definitely a big photography mistake. Oversleeping. I know a lot of photographers who do that.
You can say oversleep or not enough sleep. Both of them can be detrimental.
Yeah, I know photographers who refuse to get up in the morning to photograph because they only photograph sunsets. All right, anybody else? What's the biggest photography mistake that people can make? So I'll tell you what, looking behind them for a photo, I have actually made that mistake myself. But I have known a lot of photographers whose biggest photography mistake is not to back up their photographs. Now, consider this. Focusing will allow you, making a mistake in focusing will allow you to lose one photo, right? Not backing up your photograph will allow you to lose photos that are your entire 10 years of travel photography. When you think about backup, a lot of photographers think about backup as saying, hey, backup only occurs after you're done shooting. But actually, that's not quite true. Backup occurs right when you're shooting out in the field. And instead of talking more about the topic, I'm going to actually turn it over to Colby Brown for this particular topic. So Colby, I'll stop my share and you're up, buddy.
Thanks, man. Well, I actually go ahead and add on to what you were just saying, which is essentially that I would say that backup or image management, however you want to label it, doesn't necessarily even start in the field. I think it has to start even before that. I think to truly understand the idea of redundancy in backup and image management, you have to have a philosophy, you have to have a plan and a strategy wrapped around it. And I think you're 100% right in the sense that it is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. People will spend thousands of dollars on a backup solution only to have them lose it all in a single event because they didn't have redundancy built in to plan for the unexpected. And I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to photographers is that our images are our biggest assets, not just for people like myself that have done this professionally for close to 15 years now, but for everyone out there. You guys go on a trip, you guys, well, back when we could go on trips, at least internationally, or you go to a shooting session or you're shooting a wedding, like whatever it is, if you lose them, you can't go back in time and recreate what you had. Even if you go revisit locations, it's going to be different. So I propose that everyone completely change their mindset when it comes to creating a strategy wrapped around this. I'm going to cover that in a short little presentation here. Essentially what I have here with Visual Wilderness is I put together a tutorial that splits the time of the tutorial between image management, which is like understanding going in and renaming files and, using, smart collections in Lightroom or Bridge or any of the different programs out there that help you organize. And then the other one's purely about image backup. So I'm going to talk about image backup right now. The image management is part of the tutorial that you guys can check out if you're interested in that afterwards. But let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen and pull up I got my camera right here in the way. There we go. And then looking for screen one, image backup. There we go. Let's go ahead and share this and go ahead and start. Oop. There we go. All right. Are we seeing that? Is everyone seeing that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Beautiful. All right. So understanding image backup solutions. Again, this is the mentality essentially that we want to create a strategy and have a cohesive idea when it comes to putting something like this in place. So why is image backup so important? We talked a little bit about this. Images literally are your biggest asset. They are things that you can't recreate, regardless if you're selling them or shooting for yourself or your family or you're doing it for a job. Images can't be replaced again. They can't, you can't pull them, pull them out of thin air. Again, even if you you go back to a location or you try to recreate a scene, unless you are, maybe even if in Alan's situation, you're trying to create things back in a studio situation, maybe the, quality of the live plants you're working with isn't the same as it was a week before when you originally shot it. So even in a controlled environment, it can still be problematic. And the idea that technology can and will fail. This is one of the most dependable aspects of technology. We are so obsessed with it. I have tons of computers here in my studio. And the one thing that I can count on all of them is that eventually they will fail. Eventually hard drives will fail. Eventually, standard practices of creating a backup situation or backup strategy will fail. So we have to build in this idea of redundancy. And most photographers have just a single line of defense when it comes to backing up your images, which is, again, something that typically is only leading to catastrophic failure. If you spend a couple $100 on a couple terabyte hard drive, and that hard drive sits in your home, or you take it with you and you lose it, someone steals it, it breaks, like, you are now screwed, and that's unfortunate. And so we want to change that mindset of, hey, I have my images backed up, I'm good, to let's think about things a little bit more proactively. So redundant backup. So what is redundancy? It's essentially the inclusion of extra components that are not strictly necessary to functioning in case of failure in other components. There's a little issue there on that screen. But essentially, it's the idea that you want to build in separate backups to your backup. That's the idea. And it sounds a bit crazy once you start thinking about it, or maybe when you start thinking about it at first, but once you logically start thinking about it, you understand that if technology is always going to fail, and if you want to make sure that your images are always safe, then you do need to have some sense of redundancy built into the system that works for you, whether it's from a budget or a time standpoint. So storing your images on more than one device, this is one of the biggest things that I think people don't really think about. And again, I brought up the idea that you spend a couple $100 on maybe a 2 terabyte, 4 terabyte drive. It's sitting on your computer because it's easy to access. That's where you store all of your images. And then, what happens if you live in California, Oregon, or Washington right now, and all the wildfires happening out there, your house burns down. You're going to lose all those things. If you have all your images on a single hard drive and you go traveling, you leave a bag, someone steals it, it gets wet, the hard drive fails, all of your images, all your eggs are essentially in a single basket. And that, as our mothers have told us over the years, is never a good idea. So you also want to talk about storing your images more than one place. Again, this is coming back to that idea that, something catastrophic happens. You have all these, tornado, flooding, all this crazy stuff that you think is never going to happen to anyone, except it's might happen to you at some point. I can't tell you how many times over the last, 14 years now, that I have been surfing on Facebook or Instagram, and I see some photographer, sometimes someone I know, sitting there trying to do a GoFundMe because something catastrophic happened. They lost their hard drives, a bag was stolen. I've seen people's house literally, not seen, but read about their house burning down. Like, all these things can happen. The chances of them happening are probably pretty small, but they still absolutely can happen. And so what is the rule of 3? The idea of the rule of 3 is simply that your images don't exist, or at least are not safe, if they are not in a minimum of 3 different places at one time. And so again, that in and of itself might sound like it's a bit too much for you because you don't do this professionally. But again, you think about it, you have, for me, the little small hard drive on the left is actually like the size of a credit card. It's a little G technology drive that I use. It's super small, and what I use typically when I'm on the road. And then when I get home, I have a G Drive Studio. I use G Technology products. I'm actually an ambassador with them. And this is the big, large 48 terabyte RAID device that I use. And then also talk about the idea of online backup, which is kind of the last level of redundancy. So at any given time, my images are at a minimum of 3 different devices and multiple different locations. And I think that plays a big role in terms of making sure my images are always safe. So what options do you have? I'm going to go in a couple more of these slides and we'll probably stop and I'll take questions before I go too far. But let me jump in through at least this first section or two. So your typical hard drive, this is the hard drives that we've all, if you've been in computers or you bought technology in the last 10 years, it is the standard hard drives that you've seen. They're big, flat, generally heavy drives. They're actually optical drives, which means that they have these, they're trying to read the disks as it's spinning, which makes them very prone to having issues, at least the older models. It is usually what you typically get when you buy these big RAID devices, although you can get enterprise-based hard drives, which have a much higher lifespan and more use cases within them before they typically are supposed to stop working. But they are the bread and butter, the standard, optical hard drives for any sort of image backup or data backup. Then you have SSD hard drives. These are typically much, much smaller and generally much, much faster. They do not have moving parts. There are studies out there that show that they can be a bit more dependable in terms of comparison to optical hard drives, depending on the situation. They too obviously can fail, but they can be a bit more dependable, especially in the field, because they can take a bit more of a beating depending on the brand and the model that you get. Now, we also have two other big pieces to focus our attention on. So RAID devices and NOS devices. So RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. I know that sounds like a super geeky term, and it is, but essentially what it is it's a device that typically has a computer built into itself. You can technically build a RAID array inside your own desktop computer, but most of the time these RAID devices have their own systems built in. They have like a computer chip, have memory, have all these things, so they're independent essentially, or can be independent. And they essentially, you take multiple hard drives and you combine them into a single storage option. So the idea that you take, in this image, there's 8 different drives there. So you can take 8 of those different drives and put them together to show up as one hard drive on your computer. And there's different types of setups for those RAID devices that I don't think I'll have time to go in today. RAID 1, RAID 5, RAID 10, that give you some built-in redundancy, allowing you for your drives to fail, or 1 or 2 of your drives to fail, and your whole system wouldn't go down. So that's the big benefit of RAID devices, is that specifically. And then NOS devices. Now, NOS devices are essentially network attached storage, and they're generally RAID devices themselves. They do have built-in computers again, and they do typically require an internet connection, or at least a network connection. And the idea is that you can access them from other computers, either on your network, or if it's connected to the internet, then you can actually access them from anywhere in the world. So for me, I use this type of system where I have my main backup is this RAID device, a similar one to the one you see here, that's about 48 terabytes, as I mentioned before. And then I have a same sized device that's actually a NOS device that mirrors that, the RAID device, so that I have 2 versions of the same files. But then I can access the NOS device from anywhere in the world. I can be in Thailand, I can be in Africa. A client will reach out and say, hey, I need this file. I could then, assuming I have internet, I can connect to the internet, connect to my NOS drive securely, find the raw file or the processed image if it's a final version, and then download that and then send it off to my client. And that is a big difference from that, from a NOS standpoint, is that it's something that I control, but then I can also have access to.
So I can tell you, Colby, just giving you a break.
Oh, no, I'm muted. Hold on a second.
All right.
I forgot that my headset starts to, it goes off, it mutes itself after a while. So I'm back now, I can hear you.
So this particular instance that Colby's talking about happened to me when Colby and I were running a workshop in Iceland, right? We were running a workshop in Iceland, and one client called and said, I need these 3 files, and I need them like tomorrow.
Yep.
So Colby's sleeping like a baby in the morning after shooting, and I'm working, trying to access my NAS device to send files to the client. And just that day, I ended up making like $1,500 or $2,000.
Which is never a bad thing, right? It's never
not a bad thing, yeah. So anyway, I'll continue.
How much time do we have, actually? I was wondering how much more I can go into.
Well, if you wrap it up in like 5-7 minutes, and then we'll take questions.
Let me go over the different RAID options really quick, and then we'll stop at that point, and then we can take questions. I see some questions popping up, but I haven't had a chance to actually look at them yet, so you can help direct that once I stop here.
All right.
Okay, so a breakdown of your different RAID options. Again, this is for people that are interested in the RAID solution, which again, I think is a very positive option within this idea of image backup because it has built-in redundancy to itself. And again, it allows you to have a system that is going to be a little bit more expensive than just a single hard drive, or sometimes could be a lot more expensive depending on which one you go with, but that it can allow for the fact that your hard drives will eventually fail. So if you have 4 or 6 or 8 hard drives in an individual system, then you can allow for a few of those to fail, and then you can still replace them, and you can do what's called hot swapping, where you literally pull out a hard drive from a RAID array that is damaged or defective, and then replace it with the same type of one. It will rebuild the array, and you will have not lost a step. It's a wonderful situation. So let's talk about a few of those different RAID options that you have. So RAID 0, this is essentially where you are creating a RAID that is doubling the size of whatever hard drives you're putting together. So if you have two 2 terabyte drives, a RAID 0 essentially will make that a 4 terabyte hard drive. Now that sounds great on paper. You're like, hey, I've doubled the size. I have these 2 hard drives. The problem is that there's 0 redundancy built into this. If either one of these 2 drives fail, then your whole system comes crashing down. And again, it doesn't help you in terms of image backup. So RAID 0 is a no-go. I highly recommend that you don't do that. So RAID 1, this is a good option if you just have a 2 hard drive RAID system. This is essentially the idea that you are mirroring hard drive 1 with hard drive 2. So you can see here in this example, the block 1 and block 2, they are mirrored on top of each other. So you will have again, let's use the example of 2 terabyte drives. Your drive A and drive B will be exactly the same in terms of what is technically on them. And so if one fails, your drive has one level of redundancy backup built in. So you can have one of those drives fail and you technically can still operate and have time to change it out. So RAID 1's not bad, but again, the limitation that you get is typically the size of the RAID array that you're trying to do. And if you've been shooting like myself for many years, having just 2 terabytes of backup is not going to be enough. We need exponentially more in size. And so that's why we start looking at the other options. So RAID 5, this is the one that I recommend the most and what I personally use. There's also RAID 10, which I don't really cover, but if you're curious about it, you can Google it yourself. Just look up RAID 10 explanation and someone will share it with you. But essentially RAID 5 is the idea that out of a multiple hard drive based RAID system is that you will have parity in your RAID array spread throughout multiple different drives. And what that allows you to do is to have, in this case, a 4 drive system, and you have a bits and pieces of each of the different each of your RAID array spread throughout the different hard drives, so that if you have 1 or 2 of these drives fail, you could still your system will still work because the data has been shared throughout each of the different drives. And so you're not going to have 2 terabytes, 2 terabytes, 2 terabytes, and 2 terabytes. If we all had 4 2 terabyte drives, and then you have 8 terabytes of space, it would be less. It would be like 5 or 6 terabytes of actual usable space, but the benefit is that you get the redundancy built in. And so RAID 5 is what I have for both my NOS device as well as for my main RAID backup system. And it's great, especially if you start thinking about the fact that the drives you can purchase now are much larger. And actually go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that I can stare and talk to you guys again. So the benefit again is that now with technology, hard drives have been much cheaper than they were in the past. And so in the past, photographers like myself and I, Jay, we've been friends for a number of years. We used to get super excited about 1 terabyte drives, man. That was crazy. Like we could fit so many images on there when we had 4.1 megapixel images.
Yeah.
And now we're shooting in 4K, 8K video. We have 62 megapixel image sensors. Like space takes up a lot of, images take up a lot of space. Videos take up an enormous amount of space. And so what's happening is technology has kind of caught up to that a bit. And so you can find 10 terabyte drives for not that expensive, at least comparably to how prices have been in the past. And so that's when I have a 4 bay system for my main RAID array, but I have, I think I have 10 or maybe even 15, I think it's 10 terabyte drives in there. And so you can have a RAID 5 with 10 terabyte drives and then give yourself a ton of space. So I believe I have 48 terabytes of space technically inside my RAID array, but in terms of usable space, it's like 36 because of the parity and how things are being spread across the different drives, so that if one of those drives fail, I'll get a notification on my computer and be like, oh, I need to order a new drive, open it up. And like I said, that's what's called hot swapping. So if you get a RAID device, you definitely want to make sure that it has hot swapping. And that means that you can pick up one of the trays, pull it out of your RAID array, even while it's working. And then you can sit there, the one that's damaged, put another one in. It will take, depending on the size of your array, it could take multiple hours, it could take a day, but it will rebuild the RAID for you and you won't essentially lose a step. So hot swapping is definitely what you want with any of your RAID options. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there with the actual tutorial, but I'm happy to answer a handful of questions that we have, and I can do that as quick as I can so we can obviously let everyone else speak as well.
So before Colby answers the question, let me give you a couple of other things. That redundancy that Colby mentioned in the backup, we do that in the field as well, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, this is just an overall system. You definitely need, you ultimately want to have a bit of both, and I cover that in the rest of the piece, but you're 100%
so if
right.
you want, so if you want information on that, just look at Colby's tutorial. But that redundancy is important in the field. We always back up our shooting for a day with 3 different hard drives, even in the field. And then we'll carry those 3 different hard drives in different places. I'll have 1 hard drive in my luggage, 1 on me, and 1 will be carried by Marina as well. So I'm going to stop over here. I want to see if anybody has any questions for Colby. So
I see there's a few here. Yeah, I see there's a few here. I'm going to go ahead and scroll up, and if new ones come in, just send me let me know, Jay.
All right.
Okay, so Douglas Bank. Okay, do you reuse your memory cards or use them in a field as backup as well? This is a great question, and this is again what I unfortunately didn't get to in our presentation today, but I do cover in the tutorial. But happy to give you guys a little bit of an answer here. And the answer is it depends on the location and what I'm shooting, but for the most part, if I can avoid it, I will not format a memory card in the field unless I absolutely have to. And so I typically I have 2 small Pelican cases that each hold 16 different SD cards, because I also shoot video. And I have 2 of those things together. And the reason I have so many memory cards and have spent a decent amount of money buying all that is so that even when I'm on a big project and I'm traveling for a few weeks and shooting lots of video and photos, that I don't have to format if I don't have to. So in the field, having, keeping my images and the original raw content, whether it's video or photos, on my memory cards is generally part of my image backup strategy in the field, in addition to having portable hard drives or maybe a laptop as well, if the expedition or workshop or experience allows me to do so. So to answer your question, Douglas, yes, I try to keep that as part of my image backup solution. But I am willing to format it if I need to, assuming I have 2 or 3 other places where those images are backed up on the road. Like I said, sometimes it's taking multiple small little hard drives and stuff like that. I wish I should have had a prop here. I can actually grab it really quick while we look at, Jay, if you can grab the next question, I'll show you how big some of these portable hard drives are.
All right. So while Colby's grabbing that, one of the things that we do also recommend is we do a lot of video work, and we almost always run out of hard drive space because majority of the stuff we shoot, Marina and I, are videos, right? We only have very little photos. So we will do backup in the field, but our backup starts as soon as we are done shooting for the day. We'll start backing up on several hard drives at once. All right. So having said that, I wanted to ask anybody else have any questions about backup or image management about keywording, please feel free to solve.
Well, you guys are doing that. We're looking, I'll scroll up in a second, but this is essentially this small little hard drive, which I don't know if it's focusing on it. There we go.
Yeah.
So this little thing, to get a size comparison, it's like a little bit bigger than a credit card. This is 2 terabytes of space. So the size of these SSDs has gotten a lot smaller. Again, this is G-Tech. There's a handful of other companies out there, including Samsung, that make tiny little portable drives. And those are what I personally use in the field. So I'll usually carry maybe 3 or 4 of these because they're small, they're lightweight. And then I will store images on there as an initial form of backup. Then I might have a backup to that backup. And if I'm really crazy and feeling extra, ornery about making sure that all of my images are backed up, sometimes I'll do a third. And it just depends again on the nature of the trip or what external factors I have to worry about. Is it an image? Is it in a country that is not safe? Is it in a place where I'm super remote and things could get damaged? Like, how much safety do I want to build into what we're doing? Let me see. I'm trying to scroll up here to see.
So there's a question about Backblaze. Does Backblaze, and I think I answered it, but see if you can correct me. Backblaze does not back up RAID.
Yes,
but
it does.
It does. It doesn't back up NAS devices, I think, unless you have a.
So Backblaze, for everyone listening, is essentially an online service, and I do have a second. Actually, it was the next slide in there that I was talking about Backblaze. Backblaze is what I personally use. I've also used CrashPlan. There's a handful of other options out there, Amazon SE and sorts of stuff, that allows you to have a final level or layer of image backup. And to me, that's like the ultimate redundancy, where I'm going to spend all this money and all this time building in fast RAID devices and things here in my studio. But then again, something happens here, we're out of town, someone breaks in, steals stuff, house, heaven forbids, burns down. I also have all of my images, both raw and final images, stored in the cloud, and I use a service like Backblaze. And so Backblaze does allow you to choose, it has to be connected to a network, and allows you to, your RAID device has to be connected to your computer, and then Backblaze runs on the computer, and you can pick and choose which images you want to back up. So part of my system, anytime I make changes to some of the images in my folders that I have selected on my RAID, it automatically sees those changes on Backblaze and uploads them to the cloud, which is what I use. It's like it's a yearly fee you can pay. It's like, I think last I checked, it was like 60, $70. And to me, it's great. It's not the fastest service. It's not something that I would use to instantly always try to access images, but it's that last level of, hey, catastrophic things have happened, and I want to make sure that things are backed up. I use Backblaze. And really quickly rounding out your answer, Jay, I think you were right about NOS devices. Certain online backup solutions, depending on the NOS device that you have, will have software connection points allow you to connect to services like Backblaze to further back things up. So I think the correct answer to your specific question or curiosity with how Backblaze connects to NOS devices is that it depends on the NOS device that you have. Because like I use a Ready NOS by Netgear, and I don't believe they have a backup. They have a connection point with Backblaze, but I think other ones do. I do know that NOS devices can connect to Amazon's SE servers, for example, or other things. So it really just depends on the software options that you have with the devices that you have as well.
But if you're just using a NAS device connected to your PC and your Backblaze runs your software on a PC, it will not map that NAS drive.
Now I'd have to check it. You may be right, but assuming that you can map the hard drive on your computer, there is no reason in my mind that, assuming your hard drive is picking it up as a mapped drive on your computer, that you should be able to take Backblaze and point it to it. Now, that is just based on my logical, understanding of the stuff. Obviously, this is more of your space from your previous career. So I don't know, but I would think that if you could map it on your computer, then you could actually back it up, is my guess.
Yeah, so check that. Last time I checked, they did not allow NAS drive. I know CrashPlan does. But let me move ahead to other questions, right?
Sure.
So this is a question that is going to come up a lot, and that has come up with us is, are there backup options if you don't have a laptop with you? And I assume you're talking about in the field.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. And absolutely, there are people that don't own laptops. There are people that don't want to carry the weight of laptops out in the field. And there are a handful of backup solutions that can allow you to have some sense of redundancy when you're out there in the field. Jay, you and I were just talking before we started here about the fact that you can take at least Android phones and be able to use the extra space you have on your devices to be able to back up certain, images or videos if you have specific ones. It's not a great solution if you're trying to back up a ton of stuff, because obviously the size of our devices can be quite small. And the storage on our devices, but it can work in the field. But a more practical solution for people that at least are shooting a large amount of content is something like a NAR box, which I see Christy just put in the chat. NAR box is a device that I actually have one in the closet, but I'm not going to go get it. It's about this big, a little bit bigger than the hard drive and a little bit thicker. And essentially it has its own computer built in, and you can connect your phone to it, and then even connects external hard drives if you want to. And it has card readers built into the device, and essentially allowing you to back up either to the actual NAR box itself or as a pass through to another hard drive in the field without having a laptop, which is a great solution, again, if you don't want to carry a laptop with you to do stuff. Sometimes I do that when I'm working on more adventurous trips, or I'm traveling through locations where I know I'm not going to have power. So I don't want to bring a laptop because I'm going to be hiking in the mountains, and it's just ridiculous to carry the extra weight, let alone attempt to damage a laptop like that. So in which case, something like a NAR box would allow me to back up SD cards or CF cards. I think it's actually only SD cards to an external hard drive. So I can bring a NAR box and an extra hard drive, and that allows me to have at least one level of redundancy backup built out in the field. And that works out quite well.
Yeah, so I think that somebody said Western Digital has that option too. I agree. Western Digital, I actually looked at Western Digital option. It's actually pretty cool. It is heavy though. Both NARBox and Western Digital options are heavy compared to the hard drive itself, right? So just make sure you guys know that.
Absolutely.
And I think rather than, we can go on like this forever. So I am going to actually say, hey, if you guys want more information, a lot of this information, pretty much everything that we talked about is in Colby's thing. And he also goes into more detail about how to do image management, which is keywording, setting up the image. And one of the biggest questions that is answered in his thing is, how do you travel with Lightroom Catalog? Right?
Yes. It's always it's Adobe or
So I think, and we have like about 40 tutorials in there. Colby's tutorial for $39 sale is one of the best management classes, image management classes I've actually seen ever. So
you're too kind. You're making me blush, man. I appreciate
that. So I would highly recommend you go check it out. Colby doesn't blush very often. So.
That's true. Yeah. For you guys that are listening, I mean, again, I completely understand. Most of you guys are probably here wanting to, pick up some new tips and techniques of, Photoshop or Lightroom or Alan's macro work. All amazing, fascinating, hands-on learning that is exponentially more sexier than talking about image management and backup solutions. I 100% get that. But just know that this is about building that foundation for making sure that your images are safe. And then you can go back and edit images that you've had. I still go back and edit images I took 10 years ago when I have a break, like we have. I have a year off of work here and for a pandemic, no travel. And I have all those images backed up and stored safely in multiple different places. And so it's very easy for me to go back. And just as a really quick side point, I personally, even with my systems, have had times where I've accidentally deleted a folder or a handful of files on my main RAID system accidentally, and then had to go back through and like pull it off of an online cloud storage or my NOS devices. So even us as professionals that have built these systems, things can happen. And because I had these systems in place, I know that I am never, unless the world ends, in which case we have much more different problems, I'm going to make sure that I'm never going to lose an image as best I can avoid it. So just the last little pitch for you guys, regardless if you buy, interested in my tutorial or not, look up information online, have a system in place, and make sure that you don't lose images, because I don't want to go on to Instagram or Twitter or Facebook and see anyone that watched this, little webinar sit there and say, hey, I was about to do this, but then a hard drive failed and I lost all my images from a year or from a shoot or a trip. No one wants that to happen. So have a system in place regardless.
Yeah, and don't talk about world ending in 2020. Man, you never know what happens.
We got 3 months left, man. Things are going to get crazy.
All right. Let me go ahead to the next session. And I think this one is for David. So let me start a screen share over here. And we'll take a short Q&A session at the end. So if you guys have more questions, just have them all ready, and I'll open it up again for participants, okay? So let's go ahead and start my screen share over here. Just hang on for a second. share screen. And all right, so we talked about this. And you notice these are all trick questions by me, okay? So here's another trick question. What is more important, what to process or how to process? Let's see if people will answer this question and how you answer, because this is a more open-ended question than the other ones. What do you guys think? Hey, that's a cop-out. You can't say both. Come on. You guys have to pick one answer. I should have had multiple choices. Actually, it is correct, both, but there's one of these that is more important than the other. Go Tennessee, what to process.
Right. Go Tennessee, man. Gotta represent.
All right, so let me tell you what I think, and then I'm going to turn it over to David here. So I think they're sort of intricately connected, what to process, how to process. But we always tell people to develop skill of what to process first, and then decide on how to process. So what to process has two sides to it, right? A bunch is artistic side, and then there's technical side. How to process is a lot of technical stuff. Now, when you're post-processing, these two processes tie together very intricately with global processing adjustments and local processing adjustments. And it isn't always clear to us, even us professional landscape photographers, as to, hey, how do you separate the two out? So I will let David take over here and stop my sharing. And he is going to give us some idea of how he does going about doing global local processing and what his workflow is.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And just before I get started, I think that it's amazing being on a panel like this. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's amazing being on a panel like this. Like, I came here just to present, but it's fun to learn from people like Alan and Colby. I know Kate's presentation is going to be amazing too. And, a funny story just before we get rolling into this is just to reiterate the importance of image management and file management. I think it was the first time that we were going to work together, Jay, and do a course together. I had to emergency evacuate from Haiti. That was about a year and a half ago.
I remember that.
And the entire thing was done, filmed. I hadn't emailed it to him yet. And I only had it stored on my computer. And during the evacuation, my computer died and I had to redo the entire thing, which set us back, a couple months probably, I think, on that. But yeah, just the importance of that is astronomical. But I think there's a misconception a lot of times when we talk about what and how to process, and the link there between how you shoot in the field and what you shoot in the field, and bring that back into post-processing, no matter what you use, whether that be Lightroom, Capture One, Luminar, any of these softwares that you can use to do this, can be linked to what you shoot in the field and how you shoot in the field, and that merges over into your post-processing. So what I'm going to do here is just share my screen real quick and show you guys kind of what I'm looking at. Let's see here. I'm going to present this. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm talking about here is global versus local adjustments. And when we talk about this, it's either one or the other for some people, or it's just this conglomeration of guesswork between what they're doing in their post-processing work and workflow. And we're going to get into workflow in just a second. But Jay alluded to it, how or what to adjust in your processing. What in that sequence is more important when you get into it? So the what actually leads to the how. And what do I mean by that? Well, what you process is exactly what you shot in the field. Like when you photograph something in the field, let's say you're at a big national park, you've never been there before, and the light is just kicking off. Well, why did you take that photograph in the first place? What was it about that scene that you photographed? And that leads to how you process that. So again, these two things are linked together. So when you look at what versus how, I look at a scene like this. This was a photograph of a sunset in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And you just have this like highlighted area of trees going along this mountain ridge. And the rest of it is just really shadowed in the background. When we think about what versus how, you know, what did I see when I photographed this? And that was this highlighted section of trees versus how do you process that? Well, how do you construct a photograph? And you kind of go into the same mindset when you're doing those two things. So the workflow that we're going to talk about here puts an end to the guesswork. I think when a lot of people either start out in their journey through post-processing or they're trying to discover what they want to use to post-process their image, there's a lot of, you go into the software, you see the overwhelming amount of adjustments and sliders and tools you can use. And when that happens, you just start playing around with those and guessing at how they're going to impact your photograph. And that kind of process, that workflow sticks. And what you need to do is, yes, play around with things and experiment, but you also need to put together a strategic approach to how you adjust each image. So number one in this workflow, analysis. You know, we talked about the what and the how. Analyze what about the image you want to adjust. Let's look at a photograph here, another one from my home park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This one's on the North Carolina side. When I photographed this, and it's funny, I actually had to wade out into the freezing cold mountain water to get this image. I was up waist deep, tripod was soaked. I had to get a new tripod after this, but I digress. When you look at what, you also need to look at the how. So what about this image do I want to adjust? Well, there are some highlighted rocks on the sides and some shadowed areas on those two. I want to create more contrast in what I'm photographing and what I'm post-processing with that. So something like this, I know that I want to separate these two things out. What do I want to bring out of the highlights? Well, on the rock on the left, you know, there's some ridge marks on it. There's some algae growing on it. And all the rocks and even the trees highlighted in the background, I want to create separation and contrast in those tones and create a photograph that's compelling, because when you import a raw file, it looks nothing like this. This is the finished product, you know, of what I shot there. The raw file is much flatter than this. So looking at what you want to adjust when you start leads to how you approach that. And that how is through your different adjustments. First, we need to start with those global adjustments, the overall adjustments of what you saw when you were photographing this. And global adjustments are impacting the entire photograph. They're those types of adjustment like your overall exposure, your overall contrast, vibrant saturation, even tone curves, something getting into that. But detail sharpening, even noise reduction is going to impact the entire photograph that you adjust with these tools that you have in the different softwares for post-processing. So the global adjustments, everything in the image is going to be adjusted. If I just do highlights and shadows and do those sliders, only those overall in the photograph are going to be adjusted when you're using these sliders of global adjustments. So in this, if I lifted the shadows, you know, everything in the entire photograph is going to be lifted in the shadows. If I lift the highlights, everything in the highlights is going to be lifted. And there are a lot of different tools that you can use to do that. When you finish those though, then you want to make those final tweaks of how do you level up the photograph just that much more. I think a lot of people start, or a lot of people stop at number 2. When you move to number 3, that's when you start creating some really compelling work in your images, whether you want to just share those on social media or print them and put them on your wall, or if you want to move into doing something like photography full time. And these local adjustments are impacting just a very select area of the photograph when you start using those. So what are some tools that local adjustments are and include? Adjustment brush is something that I use in every single photograph that I create. And that's just a brush that you can paint into a specific section of the image and adjust that, whether that be contrast on that area, clarity, exposure, saturations. The radial filter is something that I use, like if I'm going and photographing a hiker through a forest and just a big forest scene, I want to draw attention to that hiker. So I'll use a radial filter around them and use some of my tools within that local adjustment to bring more attention to them. And then the graduated filter, especially with range masking. And range masking is something that has, I believe, set something like Lightroom kind of aside in itself, because with a graduated filter, you can pull down an exposure over the entire sky of the image and darken that kind of like a grad ND filter would in the field. But with range masking, you can tell the software, hey, I only want to adjust the highlighted portion of this area. I don't want you to adjust the shadowed portion that could be a mountain, a tree, anything that gets into that part of the image. So that's really important when we talk about local adjustments. And honestly, for me, I don't even use grad ND filters in the field anymore. I just use graduated filters with range masking. So with this, you know, I might paint in the adjustment brush on the highlighted areas. I might brighten those up. I'll paint in some adjustment brush on the shadowed areas and darken those a little bit to create that separation, that contrast in my tones. And then also with something like the radial filter, I might use 3 different long oval shaped radial filters on each one of the waterfall sections of this image, and then a horizontal one going across to get that bottom section and adjust the inside of that radial filter and try to get that exactly where I want it when I'm talking about, you know, the overall look of the image and the mood I'm going for. You know, Alan talked about mood of your images a little while ago. That goes into the field too. You know, how were you feeling when you shot that? What was the emotion that the scene gave you? Were you excited about a new national park that you were going to? So all those things play into what to adjust in post-processing that leads to the how of what you adjust. So remember the workflow. It's going to end your guesswork for what you are adjusting and whatever post-processing software you use. So analysis, global adjustments, and then local adjustments of going through that process and finding different ways. In the Lightroom for landscape photography, the course that I made, I think it's the one that Jay, I think I had to redo it, and that's the one we're talking about. You know, I go through these very intricately and step-by-step process of how you can use all of these tools, both globally and locally, down to the minute details of even things like noise reduction and limiting those things too. So, I mean, another example is this sunrise that I shot in Death Valley National Park. This was at Ibex Dunes, using that graduated filter on the top for local adjustment and the range masking for not eliminating the shadow portions of these mountains, using my adjustment brush in the foreground and the midground to either darken the shadows or brighten the highlights that were occurring. There's a lot that goes in here of the overall adjustments you can make. And again, in the course, you know, I go into a lot of detail about how I do that for the different types of images, big overlook scenes like this, plus smaller waterfall scenes that we talk about too in that course. So looking at the different things of what you can adjust and leading to how you can adjust is really going to set you up for success when you do start using a consistent workflow.
So let me add something to this from David's course. So I think there are two courses for David that are in sale, and they both sort of follow the same three-step workflow that he showed you. He said analysis, global adjustments, and local adjustments, right? You can take this to a step further. Let's say you want to create a very high dynamic range. You can use the same three steps, right? Analysis of the scene. Then in global adjustments, you can actually take it and create an HDR within Lightroom, and then use the range mask tools to create an image which looks so natural that it just looks like you're looking out the window. So David has two courses for sale, and the two courses, the name of the two courses, and people are asking me, is Lightroom for Landscape Photography, is where he talks about all of this analysis. And his other course is slightly more advanced, which is called HDR for Nature Photography. But he follows exactly the same three steps: is analysis, global adjustments, but in this case, the global adjustments will be with HDR, and then local adjustments. If you actually look at just the cover for these courses, you'll see that the photos that are there are superbly created, very natural looking, and it takes all guesswork out of what to process and how to process.
Yeah, and I will say on the HDR course, I think with HDR photography, just the term HDR gets a bad rap from several years ago when this technique was first introduced, and you get those overly processed images that look a little bit fake, and you get the ghosting and haloing. In the course, we really dive into how do you create a natural HDR shot that doesn't have haloing effect. How do you remove those in Lightroom? So there's a lot that goes into the little more advanced technical side of the HDR merge in Lightroom.
So David, there are a couple of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and ask do you have a favorite type of brush that you use for painting?
With the adjustment brush, you mean?
Yeah, I'm assuming that's what it means.
Yeah, with the adjustment brush, typically what I use most is just an exposure with the adjustment brush, and that's to bring down the shadows, lift the highlights, and create more contrast in there. I will say for more of like the adventure outdoor photos that I take, whether that be, a boat in the scene or a hiker or something like that, what I'll do is kind of paint in that section, and I'll do a little bit of a lifted exposure or a lifted shadow there if they're in the shadow, and then add some slight clarity to that to make them a little bit more sharp. You don't want to go over the top because that does create like the unnatural fake look, like maybe it was photoshopped in from a bad, Google image search or something like that. But you want to be very judicious in what you are painting in with the adjustment brush. But typically for me, it's just an exposure, decreasing shadows, lifting highlights.
All right. So the other thing, how do you use range masks?
Oh my gosh, that is a deep, deep question. Do we have 4 hours to go into it?
So I think go ahead.
I was going to say they're intimidating to think about because it seems like an advanced technique that you might use in something like Photoshop, but it's actually simple to use once you go through the process a couple of times. There are two different ways to use them, either with like the luminance of colors, or you can even do, what I talked about a second ago with like a sunrise scene. You can paint in a graduated filter and then tell Lightroom within a slider range that mimics a tone curve, you can pull up the shadow portion of that and just feature the highlights. But it's very hard to discuss just in like answering that verbally.
Actually, if the tutorials that are on sale today, we actually have a range mask tutorial by Mark Denny, who wasn't able to join us today because he's traveling. But the range mask I believe is discussed in your tutorial as well, David.
Yeah.
It is discussed in Alan's tutorial. Alan uses it. Mark Denny uses it. So range masks are super useful tools. So check out our special offers page, and you'll actually, the range mask tutorial by Mark Denny is phenomenally good. I mean, it's one of the best tutorials we have as well.
Yeah, not only that.
Right after Colby's, sorry. What am I saying?
Seriously, you set me up for disappointment, like following Colby and Alan. I feel like, you know, mine was just set up to fail right from the start. I will say too, range masking, it lightens your bag when you figure out how to use it. Like I said, I don't use any grad indie filters in the field anymore, just because of how powerful that technique and that tool is. Lighten my bag, have more room for, you know, instant coffee packs that I take in the field with me whenever I go camping and stuff like that. So the more important stuff gets put in the bag.
Yes. All right. So, and it's good point, Susan. It is non-destructive. Very good point. All right. So I'm going to stop over here. If you guys have more questions for David, just have them ready. I am going to go ahead and start my share and ask you one more question. Actually, it's not a question as much as the next level of processing. So we started out by saying, hey, do we have to travel for nature photography? No, well, we don't. Alan doesn't. And then we say, if you do travel, well, how do you prepare for it? And one of the things is backup and image management, Colby. And then once you come back, how do you present this thing? And then David said, hey, what to process, how to process, and just have a simple workflow analysis, global and local adjustments that will make your life so much more easier. But then you get into some more advanced techniques where you come up and say, okay, I'm traveling to a particular location, or I'm trying to shoot something in a particular shot. So for example, let's say you're trying to shoot waterfalls as opposed to you're shooting mountains, right? So what's the difference? Well, this waterfall that you saw that is filmed, I think we filmed on Colby's workshop. Colby and I were there leading a group of people, and you can see how the light is, right? The light is nice and soft. It's overcast sky. So you're always filming waterfalls in this nice soft light. And if you do photograph the waterfall in this soft light, you come up with a image with a low contrast dynamic range. And then you say, okay, so what are the skills needed to process that photo? Okay, so just think about that. Now, as opposed to if you're trying to photograph mountain scene at sunrise or sunset, right? In this case, the dynamic range will be huge because while you may find the clouds that are backlit, like they were in this situation, and then you have colors in the sky that are lit by the sun, and then you have foreground, which is completely dark. And then you have shadows, which sort of fall in the tree, which was blocking pretty much all light. So how do you determine skills that are needed for photographing waterfall as opposed to photographing mountains? Well, the post-processing skills are different. And to talk about those post-processing skills, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, because Kate uses all kinds of stuff to create images. She does. So I'll stop sharing. So Kate, you're up.
I guess that makes me a creature of many habits, master of none. Well, yeah, I do typically use quite a bit of software depending on what I'm working on, but it also has a lot to do with the overall look and feel of an image. But just, you know, when I first started processing digital images, when I switched from film, shot film. I think all of us here probably did. I had a really kind of basic routine. I would do, you know, a little bit of curves, a little bit of sharpening, maybe just a smidge of, you know, saturation. And, you know, that lasted about 5 minutes before I realized that I can't just treat every image the exact same way. You know, there's different lighting and different subject matter, and, you know, you just can't treat them all the same way. So let me show you. I'm going to share my screen. Let me just kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So this is either going to be quick and painless or a total disaster. So let's go. All right. Can you see my Lightroom?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So, you know, Jay had already touched on it. So how many of you guys like to photograph mountains? I grew up in Chicago. I don't think I saw a mountain until I was like 13 years old.
I love mountains.
I do. I love mountains. But one of the challenges that you have while you're in mountain environments is we often photograph these, you know, at sunrise and sunset, and you are presented with that high dynamic range scenario. So that's the done one. There we go. So, you know, we have these two different images that Jay and Verena actually took. And somebody's hand, I think, is down in that bottom left corner there. So we would crop that out at a later date. But you can see that if you properly expose for a sky like this, that the whole foreground goes dark. And just like David was talking about, I don't use the graduated neutral density filters anymore either. And that's because we have the technology, we have the ability to do this in post-processing without getting, you know, kind of that line that goes, would go across your screen here, across your image. Because this situation, the grad in the field would be really difficult to use because you have all of these things extending up into your sky that the grad would also cover up. And that's where the software comes in really handy. So with these two images, I would simply go to photo merge in Lightroom. And you can quickly put these together. And photo merge HDR. My computer's a little slow, I do apologize. And if anybody saw earlier or the comment that I said about the cat destroying my hard drive, that's not a joke. He was actually marching across the screen here a couple of times while I was sitting here. He just knocked it off my desk and it like exploded. So yeah, definitely back up your images. So I'm gonna just go ahead and quick merge these. It adds it to the tasks. But I will tell you that once these things are merged, that's not where I stop. I'm going to continue to work the image and create something a little bit different. Now that's the merged photo and that is my final. So I'm not going to walk you through the whole process of the entire thing that I did to it, but that was the final version. And looking at it even now, I might even add a little bit more contrast in there to some of these mountains in the background. Isn't it funny how you can work on something and you're really happy with it, and then you come back a year later and you go, oh, I need to change this and that. It's one of the beautiful things about software and doing these things in software. So let's see here. Yeah. There we go. Something else that you might notice when you're shooting mountains is a lot of times there is quite a bit of fog. Now, this image I would treat completely the opposite way of the one that I just did. So like I said, different scenarios, different environmental factors are going to affect how you process your photos. So for something like this, I don't want to lose all of this kind of foggy, distant feel in the background here, but I might want to add a little bit more detail to the foreground, and that's just a personal preference. And so let me, sorry, the little zoom thing keeps popping up at the top of my screen, and I can't even see my library and develop module choices here. So in this case, you know, like David was discussing, I approach my images in much the same way. I will do some global adjustments to start with, but I actually do very few of them. There's only a couple of items that I would treat globally, maybe a little bit of dehaze or vibrance or something like that, but dehaze is not something that I would choose here because this is what happens. It takes my fog away and I don't necessarily want that. So I might, you know, globally do a little bit of vibrance or something like that. But in this situation, I'd head straight for the brushes. And that's in Lightroom. And if I was in Photoshop, I'd head straight for the layers and treat different areas of the image independently. And so, you know, if I wanted to add a little bit just to these trees in the foreground, now mine by default, it has like a +2 on the exposure, and that's basically just so I can see where it is that I'm brushing. So let's not do that, because that was heinous. So I might just come in here and do a little bit of clarity and texture, maybe bring my blacks down just a smidge on those trees, and it just gets them to pop a little bit. But I have left the entirety of the rest of the image completely alone. So just some things to think about when you are dealing with your mountain images and thinking about the different environmental factors and really what you want the viewer to concentrate on. And so I might, I'm not going to spend all day in here, but I might take another brush and bring it up just to the top of this mountain and add a little bit of maybe magenta to it to bring out some more color and things like that. So you can spend 5 minutes in here, or you could spend an hour. It really just depends on what you want out of your photo. So quick question, how many of you guys like to photograph waterfalls? I know I do. Again, Chicago person, and wow, did I not see a waterfall for a while. I had water fountains, but not waterfalls. So one of the things that we might struggle with when we're dealing with waterfalls in particular is actually one of the good things, is that we often photograph them in overcast light. Most of us anyway, consider that the best light to photograph water in. But at the same time, when you're doing that, it really does take away some of the detail and the contrast, and it gives it kind of a flat look, because that's exactly what it is. It's a flat light. And so what I might do with a situation like this is I might want to bring back a little bit more contrast in here. So I'm just going to do that. Now I'm just going to be kind of sloppy, so please, don't judge. So there we go. And I'm going to bring down my blacks, but I'm actually going to boost my exposure a little bit. And that just gives it a tiny punch of contrast, a little bit of clarity. I love the new texture slider. If you guys have not played with this, play with it. And maybe even a little bit of dehaze. And I'm going to add another brush, and I'm going to target my water. Definitely don't want to overexpose that. But I might want to, again, bring my blacks down and brighten it up a little bit. Not so much that I'm going to really blow any highlights, and add some texture and clarity to that as well. So very subtle things that you can do. So if I click done, so where's my before? There's before and after. It didn't do much, but the way that I like to work is I like to work cumulatively. Lots and lots of small adjustments to different areas to bring out the details that I want to see. So I might do another brush here, maybe bring out some more greens in the foreground. Whatever floats your boat, whatever makes you happy when you are working on your photos. And most of what you can do, you can greatly improve an image with just one program. Just because I happen to use 12 doesn't mean that you have to. You can get a lot done with some very simple yet cumulative adjustments, whether it's Lightroom, Luminar, Capture One. It really doesn't matter what you use. It's just making the best of the tools that you have. Now, I will say, let's get into macro a little bit. So there we go. So one of the things that I struggle with macro, particularly in the field, is depth of field. Now, I often like to isolate my subject from the background. Now, this is just a completely unprocessed image. So it's kind of lacking in color and contrast and stuff, but I really loved all of the morning dew on this magnolia petal. I think it's a saucer magnolia, that's what they call it around here. And I wanted to make sure that my background wasn't going to interfere with the petals and the buds in the foreground. So I shot this at f7.1, and if I had taken it at f20, or f22, which I don't like to push my apertures all the way to the maximum like that. But, you know, if I did, this entire background would come into focus as well, and it would be distracting. It would take away from my subject, and I don't want to do that. So while I'm in the field, and this is something that you kind of have to remember to do while you're out there, because you can't do it when you get back home, is I'm going to take, make sure, here we go, 2 different images, but I'm going to just change where I'm focusing. Okay, so I'm not changing the focal length, I'm not changing the aperture, I'm not changing my exposure, I'm not doing anything. I'm just refocusing my lens on a different part of the image. Now, can I do anything with these in Lightroom? Unfortunately, the only thing that I can really do is make the general enhancements that Lightroom allows you to do. This is one of those situations that you gotta bring it into Photoshop. I am so sorry, it has to be done. So I'm gonna show you real quick. Again, hopefully this will be painless and not a disaster. So I'm going to load these files into the stack, add open files. I have tutorials on this, so don't panic if it's above your head. So, or your experience level. And then I'm going to shift and select all of my layers that it created. And I'm just going to say auto blend. And I have 2 choices here. I can make a panorama. Now, Lightroom does panoramas too, but sometimes it doesn't do a very good job. Sometimes I have to bring it into Photoshop and actually do a comparison between the 2 different versions, because they use slightly different algorithms as far as I know. But this option is I want to stack the images, and this is called focus stacking, in case you've heard of it. So it takes the sharpest part of the images, and you don't have to use just 2. This is just a quick example that I wanted to do, so I'm only using 2. But if you need to take 5 or 7 or 10 different images all focused at a different point, then that's just what you have to do in order to get what you want. So here is the result. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. So I've taken the best part of this image and blended it with the best part of that image. And now I have both of those buds in sharp enough focus right there. And I still have my nice blurry background. And so I would probably keep these layers intact. I don't often recommend flattening your layers, especially when you're doing things like this, such as focus blending, because you can come in here. It has given you a mask on both of these layers. You can come in here and fix things later if it doesn't do an absolutely perfect job. So that's really, I just wanted to walk you through a few examples. And let me go back to Zoom so I can stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Okay. Hi again.
Hi.
Walk you through those examples to kind of give you a taste of editing in different environments and different challenges that you might face based on the different environmental conditions, the light, and the subject matter. And I see there's a lot of comments or questions or something. I either freaked everybody out or have some good questions.
So I think I wanted to wrap up what Kate was saying is that, look, a lot of people prefer working in Lightroom. A lot of people prefer working in Photoshop. Sometimes you just have to use tools that make your life easier, or to get over hurdles that are just not possible in one tool or another. And remember that when you're photographing different terrains, you will have to do blending, stacking. You'll have to manage light. You will have to manage focus, selective focus algorithms. All of that may require you to expand your tool knowledge base beyond just Lightroom and Photoshop. One of the greatest tricks that I've seen a lot of people play is, hey, when you go to the waterfalls that I showed you when I was sharing my screen, waterfalls, when we did our last workshop, that thing was totally brown because of rain. It was so muddy, it would look really terrible. Well, one of the tricks you can do is to convert things to black and white. And Nik software is a great program to do that. So just want to make sure that you guys are aware of that situation. And then make sure that you know how to use different programs for different things, and you should be able to create a phenomenal image like you're dreaming about. All right, so I am going to go ahead and see if you guys have any questions for Kate. Kate, there is one question I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
You have some videos on blending and stacking.
I do. I have some with you, with Visual Wilderness, full Photoshop layers tutorials that do talk about the focus stacking and also HDR manual blending. It's probably my favorite form of doing a high dynamic range scenario. I think it just looks more natural than letting Lightroom or HDR Pro or something like that do it for me.
Yes.
Maybe I'm just a control freak. I don't know.
And you also have your mountain videos, the videos that you did for training Photoshop.
Yes,
post-processing for mountains have blending in there. David has a phenomenal blending tutorial for us. It is called focus blending for nature photographers. So if you guys really want, you can check that out. I'll see if I can get a link to that and share it. I don't believe it is included in the sale, but you can get it through a subscription service if you want.
Yeah, I mean, what I touched on with focus blending was just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot more to discuss.
Yeah, so Kate, both of their videos actually talk about exposure blending and how she does it in her mountain videos. She also talks about focus stacking on her macro photography tutorial, which goes into details. And David goes into like super great details about all kinds of focus blending you can do. So David also has another tutorial coming up with us called Creative Blending, which talks about blending for, it's my fault that it's not up yet, but it will be up hopefully by this month. So my apologies, David. But he talks about blending for night photography, blending to get multiple images together, all kinds of creative stuff you can do. So does Kate. Kate has a creative photography tutorial where she talks about using different tools. So I think I'm going to start wrapping this up and see if somebody has any few final questions. All right. So let me share my screen and I'll wrap up and tell you guys a couple of other things that are going on. So, all right. So can you guys see this? All right. So here's like a small selection of tutorials that is available for sale right now. Our subscription service incorporates all of these. And so you can think about either one. Alan's tutorials are an exception. Alan doesn't have a tutorial with us. They're all our webinar classes, and all his free webinars are available only for subscription service. So just letting you guys know that. So to finalize and give you guys some information on what we talked about in this discussion, you can take great photos right in your living room, and Alan's like the living proof of that. The backup and critical and organization. So backup and image management are absolutely critical to your workflow. All right. And think about using global versus local adjustment post-processing workflow. That is absolutely critical for your development, because it'll streamline development and it'll allow you to eliminate the guesswork. Okay. And even though you may be a fan of Lightroom or you may be a fan of Photoshop, sometimes it's much better to use different programs, because there are things you just cannot do with one program. So be open to using Capture One or Lightroom or post-processing like Photoshop or Mix software to get what you need. All right. And that wraps up our presentation. So let me stop the share, and I'm going to see if anybody else have any questions for 5 of us. All right, any more questions before we wrap it up? Yes, this is recorded. This will be shared, and everybody who has registered and people who have joined late and people who haven't been here with us, we will share this with you. All right, so there's a question for you, Kate. Nick, what is the main program? What do you use Nick with? Do you use it with Photoshop, Lightroom, or standalone?
My Nick workflow, it's actually changed a little bit since the update. For years, it was, keywording and organizing and doing all of that stuff, and then doing the raw processing in Lightroom. And then I would kick it out to Photoshop just for the purpose, if I was going to do anything with Nick, of having Nick in a layer. Just so that I could always go back and change whatever I had done in the Nick program. But now with the latest update with Nick, you can actually choose to be able to reopen the program and edit. So it's actually not necessary to go through Photoshop anymore. But that, like I said, that used to be my routine, and now you can go directly from Lightroom to the Nick programs and back to Lightroom, and still be able to get back and access all the little sliders and things like that within the Nick programs if you want to go back and make changes, which, sometimes I do, depending on, if I'm putting it up on the web, I might do something different to it versus if I'm going to make a print. And so I'll want to go back and be able to make those changes. So I like to have that flexibility in my workflow.
Cool. All right, any other questions?
I have a question for Colby real quick, if it's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's do this. My favorite color is blue.
Yeah, this is a selfish question. What compare and contrast the durability of something like a NAR box to the G tools that you were showing?
Yeah, I mean the G drive hard drives, like these small little encased things, can take a bit of a beating, but they're not IP7 rated stuff like that to be able to get submerged. Whereas NARBox typically has a higher rating, so it can handle more variable, more environmental issues in terms of durability and handling issues. That being said, I've never lost one of these on the road. But also I've never thrown them in the water. G-Tech does have other ones that are waterproof, that are bigger cases that essentially these can kind of fit into. Or you can just, put some of these, if you're traveling with them, you can get a small little Pelican case and wrap it in it. You're of course decreasing the weight and size of what you're bringing, but it does bring a bit of extra, redundancy or safety to the drives themselves. But if we were to do an A to B comparison for these specific two, I'd say the NAR box is a bit higher rated and would be able to handle more, assuming it was closed correctly and
right.
The ports were sealed as they're supposed to be and stuff like that. But yeah, either way, you can't go wrong. Do understand with the NAR box, it does take time, it does eat battery. You do have to have it charged. So typically, if you're bringing anything that needs to be charged, you also have to bring a battery, external battery support as well. I have Anchor, little battery packs that can charge these devices or charge your cameras. If you're using mirrorless cameras, you can charge most of those, most brands like the Sonys that I use out in the field using that. You don't have to be tied to a wall. So again, all these things can add up to weight and size. If you're trying to avoid bringing a laptop because of weight and size, I would make sure that it's more about environmental worries rather than weight and size, because you'll end up having to counterbalance some way in order to keep things charged or carry enough batteries. And every time you do that, you're adding extra ounces and ounces, and you'd be surprised at how quickly things equate when you don't realize, or you're not weighing your stuff until you throw in your bag. And you're like, this doesn't feel any lighter than my normal setup, and I'm supposed to be fast
Right.
and light for this trip. It can certainly happen.
So does anybody use Luminar software?
Yeah.
There you go. So there's a question about YouTube. So yeah, Luminar software is actually quite popular. I know a lot of landscape
fantastic
photographers.
software.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure Kate's similar, because it sounds like I have a similar approach to how I process my images as Kate does, in terms of, having a mixture or amalgamation of different photographic opportunities based on the desired need or effect or style we're trying to go for. And I think Luminar it fits into my workflow. It sounds like it fits into Kate's as well, where sometimes I'm processing an image, I'm looking for a certain effect. I might open Nik, I might open Color Efex Pro 4, I might open Luminar, I might open On1, depending on the needs. In theory, yes, you could technically do the vast majority of these things just in Photoshop, but for most people, the amount of time and skill it would require to learn how to do all these things sometimes is outweighed by the fact that you could spend $60 and get some of the software or $100 or whatever it is. And then it's super simple for you to integrate into your workflow and to try different things. So I think Luminar, as you said, is great. They're doing some fun stuff with AI. Some of it's controversial, some of it's amazing, but they're definitely a valid tool when it comes to processing.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that too, Colby, is like when you go out and you photograph, maybe you come back with hundreds, even thousands of images. You kind of got to look at, again, you know, Kate, you hit on this too, of what you want to achieve in the image, and that kind of reflects on what tools you use. If I need to get, you know, several images out to a client that doesn't care about my artistic expression of what I wanted to photograph in the field, I might opt for something like Luminar, where I have a lot of those AI tools where I can move one slider and it adjusts several things at one time. I can edit the image and get it to where I want it faster.
Sure.
But when I am maybe editing something for myself and want to put in that extra amount of work of, you know, global and local adjustments, you know, I usually use something like Lightroom and Photoshop to do that.
Sure. I mean, it's 6 ways from Sunday. I mean, you know, to be 100% transparent to everyone listening, how many times has any one of us ever been asked by a client either what camera gear we used or what processing software we used? As long as we're getting the results that we want, I think people should figure out the workflow that makes sense for them. And sometimes it's expediting the time investment. You know, I've seen amazing photographers. I have friends that are amazing photographers that will jump into Lightroom and have 34 or 50 different layers, and they'll spend 5 hours on a single image. And that's great for them. That's not something that I personally enjoy, but there's no wrong way to do it, I guess, is ultimately what I'm trying to say, is that, you know, I've never had a client say, hey, I wish you used a different AI software to fix this noise, like, you know, or you should have done it by hand. It just doesn't really happen. So I think it does come down to personal preference, as you were alluding to. And I think that is true. Yeah.
As long as you get to a unique place for your art.
Sure.
I find way too many people rely on a certain set of effects and their work tends to look
the same.
like everybody else's work. So please, for everyone, like we all have these tools, use it. And these post-processing programs are all recipes.
Yeah.
Think of them as starting points and then you add your own special touches to it.
That's great. I love that. They're not ending points, whether they're presets or not, however you're learning the process, like it's definitely, you 100% agree, Alan. They're starting points for your creative journey. They're not the end result.
So I think with that note, I would like to say thank you everybody for attending. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Look for future webinars and information discussion sessions from Visual Wilderness. This was great. Thank you, everybody. And I will send a recording out to everybody that joined us, as well as everybody who has registered and were not able to join us. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Great
you.
session.
See you guys. Cheers.
Bye.